Thank you for joining. Those of you who maybe have not been on one of our webinars yet, I'm Jenna George, president of Goodman Speakers. I'm so glad that you decided to share this time with us today and take time out of your busy schedule to be with us. I'm really excited about today's presentation. As always, I feel that it's extremely timely, and I chose today's speaker specifically to what we're seeing, requests that we're getting, and the need for specific content. So our guest speaker today, to put it simply, helps companies impress their customers. He is Jon Picoult, the founder of Watermark Consulting and a leading expert on customer experience. Jon has advised the C-suite at some of the world's foremost brands, and his insights have been featured by dozens of media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, NBC News, and Forbes. He's also got a new book on customer experience coming out this fall titled From Impressed to Obsessed. Jon studied cognitive science at Princeton and holds an MBA from Duke. Today, Jon's here to tell us about how great customer-obsessed companies excel during the best of times and the worst of times. Please welcome Jon Picoult.
All right, this is where I come bounding onto the stage. See, it's just like real, only a little different. Welcome everybody, and I'm happy to be here with you, and I want to thank Jenna and the team at Goodman for collaborating on offering this webinar to you all. I've got about 30 minutes worth of remarks, then we'll open it up for Q&A. As you can see, my topic is about strengthening customer loyalty during difficult times, and let's face it, we've all been through some difficult times lately. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, we were still sort of coming out of the Great Recession, the impact of the Great Recession. Unemployment was still sort of coming down from the peak of the Great Recession a decade ago, when then COVID hit and we went really into the Great Cessation, where entire economies and societies hit the pause button due to the pandemic. And regardless of whatever the reason is for the economic dislocation, the key challenge for businesses is just the same. How do you weather the storm? How do you make sure you come out stronger on the other side? How do you make sure that when people are cutting back, that they're not cutting back on your offerings, your products and services? And if they are cutting back, to make sure that your business is one of the first ones to which they return. And my answer in terms of how to do that, how to weather the storm in that way, really centers around the delivery of a great customer experience. Because the fact of the matter is that companies that are beloved outperform those that are not. And that is a true statement both in good times and bad. And if you have any skepticism around it, I'm actually going to prove it to you right now. Because one of the things that my company does is we actually look at the stock market performance of the top publicly traded companies in customer experience, the CX leaders, versus the worst in customer experience, the CX laggards. And we've got 13 years of data here. Now, mind you, we're not picking the leaders and the laggards, so it's not like we're stacking the deck. We're using third-party research studies done by well-known research firms that interview like over 10,000 consumers a year to rank 250 companies in the quality of their customer experience. And so you can see here that over this 13-year period ending in 2019, if each year you had invested in the top 10 customer experience leading companies, you would have far outperformed the S&P 500 market index, indicated by the blue bar, and you would have blown away the customer experience laggards. The leaders outperformed the laggards by an over 3-to-1 ratio. But here's where the story gets really interesting. If you look at this data just for the 3 years during the last recession, during the Great Recession, here's what it looks like. And so you can see that while even the CX leaders were obviously affected by the economic downturn, they were far more insulated from the impacts of it relative to the broader market and to the laggards in customer experience. I mean, the leaders even eked out an increase in shareholder value during the last recession. So to me, this is really the exclamation point on the case for customer experience, not only in good times, but in bad. These companies in green are enjoying all the benefits of the loyalty lift that comes with a great experience, and that's why they're able to weather these storms more effectively. So the key question kind of becomes, how do you get your company to be in the green bar? And I think the first way that I want to tackle answering that question is we got to make sure we all have a level set around just what this thing called customer experience is. Because if you think that term is synonymous with customer service, then I would beg to differ. And one of the things that these companies in the green bar have in common is really a shared definition, a common appreciation for just what the customer experience is. And so to illustrate that point, I actually want to tell you a story about something called rap rage. Now, if you've never heard of this term rap rage, I want to give you the definition of it from Jeff Bezos, the founder and CEO of Amazon.com. Bezos once said that rap rage is, quote, the frustration we humans feel when trying to free a product from a nearly impenetrable package. This is a trigger of rap rage. They're called clamshell or oyster shell packages. Very often kids' toys, electronics, these days LED light bulbs come in this packaging. And all of you as consumers know that once you start to rip open this packaging, the edges are razor sharp. What you might not know, though, is that in the United States alone, each year, over 6,000 people end up in the emergency room with injuries inflicted from rap rage. They're trying so hard to extricate the product from this ridiculous packaging that they lacerate their bodies so badly they need to immediately seek out help from an ER doctor. Now, scores more suffer minor scrapes and puncture wounds, like this poor soul. You might be familiar with one of those injuries. And then, of course, we can't forget about the masses of children who experience psychological and emotional trauma as they wait patiently while their mom or dad is opening up their Christmas present or their birthday gift, all the while witnessing their parents mutilate their bodies in the course of doing so. All right, now, so obviously, rap rage, serious but amusing healthcare issue, but the reason I tell this story is because Amazon.com's response to the phenomenon of rap rage is a great example of a company truly appreciating what the customer experience is and how to actively manage it. And here's how the story goes. In the mid-2000s, Amazon started to get feedback from their customers, and it was feedback along the lines of, gee, it was really easy to buy off of your website, but boy, it was a bear to open up the package that you sent me. Amazon customers even started sending the company photographs and notes on this topic. This is an actual photo sent by an Amazon customer to the company, along with a note that said, these are all the tools I have to use in order to open up the packages that you send me. Well, in 2008, Jeff Bezos and his management team hatched their response to the phenomenon of rap rage, and it was called frustration-free packaging. And basically what it meant is that wherever possible, Amazon negotiated with their suppliers. So the supplier would take the product out of the metal twist ties, remove it from the clamshell, they give it to Amazon, Amazon takes it, puts it in their box, they ship it to you. You get it, you take it out, use it, give it to your kids. There's no crying or tears, no blood or lacerations, and everybody's a lot happier. And this has actually become something of a competitive advantage for Amazon because brick and mortar stores, they actually use the clamshells as an anti-shoplifting device. Moreover, it's become yet another compelling proof point for the Amazon brand in terms of how easy it is to do business with them. But what I want you to take away from this story is Amazon's appreciation for the broad array of touch points and interactions that really comprise their customer experience. They recognize that even if subconsciously, people's perceptions of Amazon will in part be influenced by how easy or difficult it was to open up the package. And so they manage that final touch point in the life cycle as deliberately and intentionally as any other. And the irony is that many people would argue it's a touch point that is outside of Amazon's wheelhouse. Many people would say, hey, once Amazon ships it from their warehouse, that's it, they're done. But Amazon doesn't see it that way, nor should you. As you go back to your office, as you interact with your colleagues, I would encourage you to encourage them to think very broadly about the universe of touch points and interactions that comprise your company's customer experience. Because I would submit to you that it begins far earlier than you imagine, well before somebody's a customer even, during the pre-sale phase, and it actually persists longer than you'd expect. Heck, you hope you never have a customer that defects from your company, but if they do, I'd argue that point of defection deserves to be managed as deliberately and intentionally as any other in your life cycle. So this is Bezos' definition of customer experience. He notes it is bigger than customer service in that it is the full end-to-end experience. It starts when you first hear about Amazon from a friend and ends not when you get the package in the mail, but when you get it and open it. So you can see that customer experience is much broader than customer service, and it really encompasses every live, print, and digital interaction point that customers could possibly have with you. So now that we've got sort of this level set around just what customer experience is, let's go back to this question of what are these companies in green doing in order to achieve this outperformance? And the first piece of advice I have for you to answer that question is this: they're not satisfying their customers, and you shouldn't either. If you are aspiring to satisfy your customers, then you are aspiring to mediocrity. Because study after study has shown that satisfied customers defect all the time. So if you're trying to derive competitive advantage, economic advantage from the customer experience you deliver, it's not sufficient to just satisfy your customers, you need to impress them. So how do you do that? Well, that's where I want to unveil these 12 principles. In my many years of studying companies that do this well, the legendary, beloved, widely admired companies, I've basically distilled the techniques that they use to shape their interactions with customers into these dozen principles. They're actually the centerpiece of that new book that I have coming out in October. And while today in our short webinar, I'm not going to have time to go through all 12 principles, I am actually going to cover 2 with you. And I picked these 2 because I think that the examples that I have are really effective in terms of showing how companies use these principles during the most challenging times in order to weather those economic storms. So the 2 that I'm going to cover with you are about creating relevance in the customer experience and paying attention to the details. Let's start with creating relevance. And let me begin actually by defining what relevance is in the customer experience. It's basically about delivering products and services and an experience from which your customers derive significant value. Whether it's about satisfying their overt, explicit needs or addressing maybe their tacit, implicit needs, things that they never thought to articulate or vocalize, but yet you know you can help them with. That's the way you create a relevant experience. It addresses both their explicit needs as well as their implicit needs. Now, to give you a kind of an example of how relevance works in the marketplace, I think that a relatively recent yet classic example actually comes from the world of GPS-enabled apps. Because if you think about it, before there were GPS-enabled smartphones, if you actually went to your mobile device and you did a search for, say, pizza places when you were in the middle of Manhattan, you would actually get a list back of pretty much every pizza place in Manhattan. But that's not really relevant to you. The question that you were really asking was probably, what are the pizza places near me where I am right now in Manhattan? And so what GPS-enabled apps allowed people to do was to create that more relevant experience. Because instead of just giving that sort of long list of, here are all the pizza places, you can tell me exactly where mine is, where the nearest one is to me, where I am. That's a much more relevant experience, much better experience. And that's why GPS-enabled apps took off in popularity to such a strong degree once the technology was available. I think I need to let somebody in here for just a moment. There we go. All right. So let me show you an example now of a company that used relevance in order to help it weather a really severe economic storm. And that would be during the Great Recession, and that is Hyundai automaker. During the height of the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009, Hyundai actually increased its market share in the United States by 40% when every other auto manufacturer was seeing their sales plummet. And you ought to ask yourself, how the heck did they do that in the middle of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression? And the answer is that they figured out a way to make their experience that they were delivering a bit more relevant in light of what was going on in consumers' minds at that time. Because here's what was happening. At the end of 2008, car sales had plummeted for every manufacturer. But the thing that really scared the automakers was that the traditional incentives that they were using in order to draw people into the showrooms during economic recessions, things like financing deals, purchase incentives, rebates, those things weren't working this time around. And so they were getting real worried. And unlike a lot of other automakers, Hyundai actually stepped back and they rethought what was important and relevant to their customer. And they actually did it by going out and speaking to customers and having in-depth interviews with them. And what they came to realize was that people weren't buying cars not because they didn't need cars. Plenty of people still needed cars in the Great Recession. And people weren't buying cars not because they didn't have the money for cars. Plenty of people still had the money to buy a car. What they pinpointed was the reason people weren't buying cars is they were afraid. They were afraid that they would buy the car and then the next day they would get laid off from their employer and they would be saddled with these car payments that they couldn't afford. Because remember, at this time in the US, the economy was shedding hundreds of thousands of jobs each month. And so when Hyundai finally came to this realization, they pivoted, and instead of focusing on sales incentives, they started to focus on fear mitigation. And that's when they rolled out in January of 2009 what was called the Hyundai Assurance Program. And basically what it meant is that they said to the marketplace, listen, if you buy a car from us and within 12 months of buying the car, if you are laid off from your job for any reason at all, just bring the car back and we will take it, no questions asked, and we'll forgive all remaining payments. It was a huge game changer for Hyundai. As I said, they increased their market share by 40%. The month that they introduced this, their sales went up 15%, while the rest of the auto industry was down 40%. And their brand recognition in North America was elevated to a level that heretofore had never been seen. And it really came down to them just tweaking the experience in order to make it more relevant given what was going on in the minds of consumers at that time. Because people were afraid they were going to lose their jobs. And so Hyundai figured out a way to tweak the experience in order to address that fear, to take it off of the table. And once they did, people flocked to the showrooms and they bought those Hyundai automobiles. So that's really the first lesson here, is that if you want to create relevance, you have to sort of step back and ask yourself, what is important to my customer? Because in times of economic distress, what was important yesterday is likely not the same thing that's important to them today. Now, this might beg the question of, how do you figure out what is actually relevant to your customers? And I actually want to speak to that by showing you another example from another auto manufacturer. And this one is between Ford and Chrysler. In the early 1990s, Ford and Chrysler, and mind you, Chrysler, in case you don't know, Chrysler has dominated the minivan category for over 35 years. Absolutely dominated it. In good times and bad, economic highs, economic lows, they've been the dominant player. And the reason that they've been able to do it is because they've been very effective at creating products that achieve great relevance with their target consumer market. And I'm going to show you how that works. Because in the early 1990s, Ford and Chrysler were considering a redesign of their minivans. For those of you that remember, back at that time in the early 1990s, minivans actually had only 3 doors. There was a door that opened on the passenger side front seat, on the driver's side front seat, and then there was just one sliding door on the passenger side. The driver's side back seat actually had no opening. It was just solid. And so Ford and Chrysler were redesigning their minivans, and they wondered, should we add a 4th door? Should we add a 2nd sliding door? But they went about answering that question in very different ways. Ford went out to customers and chatted with them and basically said to them, would you like a 2nd sliding door on the vehicle? And they sort of encountered kind of a lukewarm reception. And in the end, they deprioritized that and they rolled out their 1995 Ford Windstar with the traditional layout of just 3 doors. You can see it right there on the left, that on that driver's side, it's solid in the back seat. But Chrysler, with their Dodge Caravan, their 96 Dodge Caravan, did something different. They actually did what I call going out into the wild and observing your customer in their natural habitat. Because oftentimes the most brilliant insights about customers don't come from an antiseptic focus group room or a dry research survey. They actually come from going out into the wild and observing customers in their daily lives as they're using your products, as they're bastardizing your products or services to get it to do whatever they want it to do. So the Chrysler design team actually went out to parking lots and lumber yards and shopping centers, and they just watched people using their minivans. And they actually videotaped them, and they started to learn all kinds of things about annoyances and frustrations that people encountered that they never thought to vocalize because it was second nature for them. They just sort of took it as a basic, fact of life. And so here's a quote actually from the lead design engineer on the 1996 Dodge Caravan. His name is Chris Theodore. And when he recounted this experience, he said, "We really had a great time. We looked at customers, we visited customers, we videotaped customers at rest stops, truck stops, and lumber yards. That's where we came up with all the ideas, from cup holders to tissue holders to roll-out seats to the fourth door. These were all things that we saw the customer needed, but didn't volunteer when asked." And so this is a really important takeaway, that when you're trying to create relevance, particularly in times of economic distress, you can't just, within the bounds of your own office, kind of divine what's important to your customers. You need to go out, you need to watch them, you need to observe them, because oftentimes their implicit needs are things that they don't even think you can help with. It's second nature to them. They just sort of accept the annoyance of having to reach over in the van and install a children's car seat. And it's only when a third party sort of looks at that and sees the insanity of that and says, we can do better. So you want to make sure that you immerse yourself in your customer's life, and that's how you come up with new products and service innovations in order to create greater relevance for them. Now, the coronavirus pandemic has actually created many opportunities for companies to step back and ask themselves, what's relevant to our customers now? And I just want to share a couple examples with you. One comes from Woolworths. They're a grocery store in Australia, and they were one of the first retail establishments in the world that rolled out dedicated early morning hours for senior citizens. Because when the pandemic hit, what they realized when they immersed themselves in the lives of their customers was that senior citizens were staying away from the store, even though they needed to buy basic foodstuffs. Because the store was so crowded, as people were trying to hoard things as the pandemic raged around the world, senior citizens stayed away. And Woolworths then actually rolled out this tweak to their experience where we said, hey, the hours from 7 to 8 a.m. are going to be reserved for senior citizens. No one else can come. And those people flocked to the store during those early morning hours and felt so much better about shopping because it was far less crowded. Think about how that engages Woolworths customers when they're in a position of vulnerability and Woolworths reaches out with that more relevant tweak to address that particular need that constituency has given the pandemic. A second example I'll give you is Scholastic Books. When in the US, when schools, K through 12 schools, got locked down and closed, Scholastic actually rolled out for free online a whole series of lesson plans that parents and instructors could use to help keep kids engaged as they began doing remote learning. Again, completely free. Think if you're a parent that's trying to kind of keep your 6 or 7-year-old engaged and sort of continuing to learn things as they're locked down in remote schooling, think of how that engages you. Think about how your brand impression of Scholastic gets elevated as a result. That's a great example of Scholastic rethinking the experience they can deliver in light of what was relevant to people at that time during the pandemic. All right, very good. So let's go on to our second principle that I'm going to cover with you, and that's about paying attention to the details. The fact of the matter is, the way our brains are wired, we don't remember every single part of the experience that we go through with a business, but we can be influenced by every detail. We might not remember every detail, but it can influence us, even if subconsciously. And to illustrate that point, I want to tell you about something I call the lampshade effect. Ritz-Carlton, obviously renowned for their customer experience, their housekeepers actually have a 200-point checklist for reviewing a room after they go in and they service it for a guest. And you might be like, my gosh, why do they have a 200-point checklist? And the reason is that they know that if anything is out of place in that room, if a lampshade on the nightstand next to the bed is a little cockeyed, they know the guest is going to walk into that room, and even if subconsciously, they're going to look at that lampshade and they're going to say, what else is wrong in this room? What else did they forget to tend to or to check? And so the lampshade effect is sort of a tendency for people to take a small error or oversight in the customer experience and infer from it that something larger is awry or amiss. So it's very important to pay attention to those details. And mind you, the details can be addressed not only to avoid a contradiction to the brand experience, the impression you're trying to create, the details can also be used to enhance and to buttress the impression that you're trying to create. Let me show you some examples of how this works. Let's start first with details that could potentially contradict the impression that you're trying to create. And we'll begin with Disney, obviously renowned for their customer experience. Here's the thing about Disney. In their theme parks, if you ever come across a door where guests are not allowed to enter, it will never be labeled like this. It will never say, "Do not enter." You will always see doors like that where guests cannot enter. They will be labeled like this: "Exit only, please." And the reason for this, and the reason Disney tends to this detail so carefully, is because they know that in their parks, the tone, the ambiance that they're trying to create is sort of a fun, amusing, engaging, accessible atmosphere. If people see a sign on a door that says "Do not enter," Disney knows that that has an authoritative connotation to it, and it completely disrupts the tone that they're trying to create in the park. And so that's why they will not use those three words anywhere in the park. You're going to see the much more polite and delicate "Exit only, please," to denote some door or place that guests are not allowed to go. That's an example of using a detail to make sure that you are not contradicting, even if subconsciously, the impression that you're trying to create through the brand experience. Now, let me give you an example of a company that actually used details, not so much to avoid a contradiction in the experience, but actually to buttress the type of ambiance and the type of feeling that they were attempting to create. And the company is Starbucks. Again, another company just perennially at the top of the customer experience rankings. I mean, where else will people pay $2.50 for a cup of coffee that you could get for much less at many other places? But people go there because they love the experience that they get, the whole thing, the third place, the sights, the sounds, the aromas, everything. Well, here's the thing about Starbucks. Many people forget this, but at the time of the Great Recession in 2008, Starbucks had actually run on tough times. Their stock had lost half its value in the preceding 15 months. And in January of 2008, they actually brought their founder, Howard Schultz, who was in the chairman role, they brought him back into the CEO role to rescue the company and turn it around. And the first thing that Howard Schultz did, he actually did something we just mentioned before. He went out into the wild and he visited Starbucks around the world, observing customers and baristas. And after 3 months, he came back in March of 2008 and he gathered his top 200 executives at a meeting to unveil his turnaround plan. And he had a short number of items on the list, but one of the key items that he had that he introduced to his team of 200 executives, he said, "I want to immediately rip out and replace every espresso machine in every Starbucks around the world at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars." And you might be saying to yourself, "Oh my gosh, when Howard Schultz went to these Starbucks and visited them, the taste of the espresso must have been awful for him to come back and say, we've got to rip out all those machines." But here's the incredible thing. It had nothing to do with the taste. As a matter of fact, the taste of the espresso was just fine. Here's what Howard Schultz had picked up on. What he realized when he visited the stores is that the espresso machines that Starbucks was using at the time were high-profile machines. And what that meant is that the barista was unable to maintain eye contact with their customer as they made them their drink. And when Schultz saw this, he thought that it completely undermined the entire romance and theater that he was trying to create through the Starbucks stores, because they were meant to create sort of an authentic coffee house feeling. And in his view, if the barista could not maintain eye contact with the customer while making their drink, then that customer might as well have been in McDonald's or some other fast food chain getting an espresso, because it was basically the same thing. And so that's why Schultz came back and said, we've got to rip these out. As a matter of fact, he actually contracted with a Swiss firm that designed a special espresso machine just for Starbucks. This is him on stage introducing it. It was much lower profile. Here it is in the actual store, and you can see the barista can maintain eye contact with the customer as they're making them their drink. This is a great example of paying attention to the details, at a cost, mind you, of hundreds of millions. But it actually paid off, because between this change and the others that Howard Schultz made, in the years after the Great Recession, Starbucks actually outperformed the S&P 500 market index by an 8-to-1 ratio. So not only did they recover out of the recession, but they came out of it like gangbusters and just, catapulted ahead, far ahead of where they were even before the downturn. So details matter. Sometimes the small things can actually be the biggest things, because subconsciously those details can help reinforce an impression that you're trying to convey to customers as they go through their encounter with you. And let me give you an example here with the coronavirus of a company paying attention to details to accomplish this. Sam's Club, again, another company that is perennially among the top tier rankings of customer experience cross industries. Just earlier this week, their CEO was actually interviewed by the New York Times and mentioned something about how they responded to the COVID pandemic. What she described is that once the stores reopened after they were locked down, they had people that were disinfecting the shopping carts as they pulled them back from the parking lot and brought them into the cart corral in the store. So they were sitting there in the cart corral and they were all disinfected. But yet what they decided to do was to make sure that there was an employee at the entrance, visible to any customer coming into the store, within 10 feet of coming into the store. The CEO wanted to make sure that every customer would see a Sam's Club employee wiping down and disinfecting a cart, even though they had already been disinfected. And the reason they did this is because customers don't know that those carts are being disinfected when they're brought in from the parking lot. And they wanted to create a detail, a cue, so that when people entered the store, they immediately saw that Sam's Club was taking COVID safety protocols seriously and was interested in protecting their health and their well-being. And so that's, you might look insane that you have somebody positioned there who's disinfecting carts that have already been cleaned, but that's an example of paying attention to a detail to create a certain message that's going to leave the customer with an impression, in this case a positive one, about the COVID protocols in place at the store. All right. So those are the two examples. As I wind up here, just to kind of impress upon you again, reinforce three key points. This is hardly a comprehensive prescription for overcoming challenges in difficult economic times, but there are a few key points. One, rethink what your customers really care about. Step back, reconsider in light of the changed circumstances. What was important to them yesterday is likely not the same thing important to them today. If you can put your finger on what's important to them today and then make tweaks and changes and innovations to the products and services you offer to capitalize on those changes, you're going to be in a much better position weathering the storm. Second, in order to accomplish that and understand what's relevant to them, you want to make sure that you go out into the wild. Watch those customers in their natural habitat. Don't just pay attention to surveys and focus groups. Watch it with your own eyes, because that's where the most brilliant insights are. And then lastly, remember to obsess over those details. The details matter. Smallest details can make the biggest difference, and as a matter of fact, details can be the key to creating a distinctive and differentiated experience. So those are three key takeaways for you, and in closing, I just want to leave you with this thought. Impress upon your colleagues as you talk to them, your goal should be to leave it to your competitors to satisfy customers. Your focus instead should be on impressing them. To deliver an end-to-end customer experience that is exceptional in its polish, its professionalism, its relevance, and yes, its attention to detail. Because the lesson from legendary companies is clear. In good times and bad, if you obsess over your customer experience, then your customers will obsess over you. All right, very good. So that is the end of our presentation. I think we've got some time for Q&A. I'm going to do a quick AV camera change, and then we'll be back and we will take questions.
Thank you so much, Jon. Wow. So I've seen you present multiple times. I always take something away from it. Today, my biggest takeaway was obsessing over the details. The lampshade effect was something that really struck me, because I feel that I'm a very detail-oriented consumer. So that was interesting to me. But I think that, as a business owner, I am always trying to make sure that I do the best that I can for my clients, and obsessing over the details is my takeaway today. If anyone wants to ask a question, I'm going to kind of get us started and maybe ask one or two, but if anybody would like to ask a question, feel free at this time to share to unhide your video and to join us so that we can have some conversation. You also can type a question into the chat and I will ask Jon myself for you. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, Jon, you made kind of a bold statement about satisfying your customers, not to satisfy your customers. That might strike some people as a strange request or strange guidance. Satisfaction seems to be a bar, and I appreciate that is not the case with you. But can you explain more about that? Explain that advice. Why shouldn't we satisfy our customers?
Sure. And you can see me okay now?
Yes, you look great.
All right, good. So, here's the thing with satisfaction. As I said, studies have shown that satisfied customers defect all the time. But the issue is that satisfaction doesn't leave a memory, an indelible impression on your customers. And no matter what business that you're in, think of it this way. When somebody says to one of your customers, hey, what do you think about company X? Or their product or whatever. The next thing that's going to come out of their mouth is not going to be based on the experience that they had with your company. It's going to be based on what they remember about that experience. And those are actually two different things. The way our memories work, we don't remember every detail in the experience. And so the idea of impressing people is about really shaping their memories and creating that indelible impression so that you are actually sculpting their memories in a way so that when they are posed with that question, when they're thinking to themselves, gee, should I continue doing business with company X? Should I refer this person to company X? That you're leaving that impression on them so that their recollection of the experience is such that they automatically say, yes, I love company X, or yes, I'm going to continue doing business with them. And that's really why the impression is so critical, because satisfaction alone does not create those kinds of memories.
Understood. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, something else that jumped out at me was when you mentioned Starbucks in 2008 and how they ripped out all of the espresso machines at a time where they were, struggling financially. Obviously, 2020 has been a tough year fiscally for many, many people. So talk to me about the differentiation between delivering a better experience while also trying to rein in costs. Do you see a comparison there, or what do you think on that?
Sure. So, lots of people, when they think about delivering a better customer experience, their head immediately goes to, whoa, that's going to cost more. They think like Ritz-Carlton, and they just imagine themselves, there's no way we could afford to deliver a better customer experience. But the fact of the matter is that certain types of experience enhancements can actually pay for themselves, and almost be free. And the reason that I say that is because if you improve your customer experience upstream, if you do something upstream that helps to preempt dumb avoidable reasons why customers contact you downstream, then essentially what you've done is you're delivering a better experience, and you're able to do it at a more competitive cost because there's less stress on your operating infrastructure. Take, for example, if any of you have ever received like an EOB from a health insurer that you couldn't understand, or a billing statement from a cable company that you couldn't make heads or tails of. What do you do when you get one of those things? You call the company up. And the minute you do that, and every other customer is doing that, it drives expense in the organization. So if you do something to that EOB, if you make it more visually appealing, easier to understand and interpret, same thing with a billing statement, not only are you delivering that better experience, but you're preempting the reason why the customer has to contact you later. And so that allows you to actually better control your operating expenses. So in my view, it's a false choice to say that a better experience always has to be accompanied by higher costs. I actually don't think that's the case at all.
Great. Yeah, I'm right with you with the EOB in the paperwork.
Actually, and on that point about the EOB, It's pretty amazing. We talk about Amazon, how they obsess over packaging, right? Many health insurers, they view their EOB as an administrative document. And what they don't realize is that for many of their customers, it is the primary interaction point that you ever have with your health insurer. I mean, that is it. And yet many health insurers, they view it as an administrative document, and so they don't invest in it. They don't try to make it, deliver a good impression through it. And that's really unfortunate.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Before I continue, because I have a couple of more questions that I certainly could ask, but does anyone have a question for Jon while we have him here today? I think that I always find you to be such a fruitful resource for, client experience and customer experience. Can you tell us more about the book that's coming out this fall too? Because I'm really excited about that one.
Sure. So the book is called From Impressed to Obsessed, 12 Principles for Turning Customers and Employees into Lifelong Fans. It comes out in October. It's being published by McGraw-Hill. And it really focuses around those 12 principles. And it's filled with, really captivating stories and research that illustrates how companies take these principles, many of them really grounded in behavioral psychology and cognitive science, take them and apply them to the business arena in order to strengthen and cement customer engagement and loyalty. And the other interesting wrinkle to the book is it actually talks about how the very same principles can be applied to a different type of customer audience, the customers who are your staff. For people in leadership positions, I think that, and the term servant leadership is something that probably everybody's familiar with, but servant leadership is really about viewing your own employees in a way as a type of customer. And so the book also talks about how leaders can use these principles to better engage their own employees and impress them and strengthen loyalty with them towards the employer and towards the leader.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, we're hearing a lot about servant leadership and workplace culture and all of those things. So that's wonderful to know that the book touches on that. Yep. Does anybody want to ask a question? I don't want to, speak over people.
Don't let Jenna dominate it. Come on, everybody.
And I tend to do that.
We don't bite.
Anyone? No. All right. I'm happy to keep going.
They're just stunned in silence.
I know. I don't want to, I don't want to take over, but if anybody wants to. Okay. Okay, so you just mentioned the 12 principles, and the 12 principles are in the book. You covered 2 today. Do you have a favorite principle, and why? Something that maybe you didn't cover today, and you wanted to just touch upon as like a bonus principle for today's.
Sure. Yeah, bonus, right? That's all. We're all about impressing here. So let's give more than anybody ever thought they were going to get. All 12 principles are my babies, and so I love them all. But, if there is one that I'd actually highlight for you, it's one that I find is actually almost magical in the way it operates. And the principle is about giving the customer the perception of control. This, again, goes back to cognitive science. We as human beings, we like to be in control of our lives, our surroundings. And when we feel like we're not in control of what's going on around us, when we don't have our hands on the steering wheel, the experience actually feels less good to us as a result. But the neat thing is, research has shown that if you give people the sense, the perception that they have control, even if you don't change anything about the underlying experience, they actually feel better about it as a result. And that's why I say it's kind of magical. It's a way to make the experience better without actually changing the mechanics of the experience. And I'll give you an example. This is one from the book that illustrates this. There was a study done with the Red Cross with people volunteering to have blood drawn in blood drives. And what the researchers did is that they took 3 groups of people. One group of people, they just, they sat down and the phlebotomist just picked an arm and drew the blood. With another group of people, they actually gave them a choice to pick which arm they wanted to have the blood drawn from. And then with the last group of people, they didn't give them a choice of arm, but they actually showed them a 2-minute video that explained exactly what the procedure was going to entail. Well, the people who saw the video or had the choice of arm came out from the procedure and actually said that it was less painful and more pleasant than they expected, compared to the folks who didn't see the video and had no choice of arm with blood to be drawn. And what the researchers concluded was this was perception of control in action, because one way to give people a sense of control is to set expectations for what they're about to go through, so they sort of know what's coming around the corner, what's on the horizon. Another way to give them the sense of control is to give them limited choice, like which arm do you want blood drawn from? And so in business, just merely setting expectations with your customers, before they go through a part of the experience, just telling them, hey, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to walk you through the steps, or giving them some limited choice to exert, even if it's meaningless choice. Those are 2 ways to actually get people to feel better about the experience you're already delivering, because they suddenly feel like they've exerted some control over it. So I really like that principle because it costs nothing to implement practically, but it's really powerful and magical in its impact.
I like that one a lot too, because I am definitely that person that needs to feel at least that I have some sense of control, even when I don't.
Yeah,
Okay,
you're
we
not
have a
alone.
question in the chat. When introducing customer experience as an important concept that needs to be prioritized by the executive team so the whole company gets on board, where would you start?
Yeah, so I have two thoughts for you there, and this is a common challenge because there are a lot of executives that are inherently skeptical that it pays off to focus on customer experience. But the first thing that I have found is that study that I shared with you with the bar graph that showed the long-term impact from a shareholder value standpoint of customer experience leaders versus laggards. I find that's a very powerful way at a macro level to show skeptical executives, hey, there's something here. And I find it works even with private companies, even ones that aren't, traded publicly, because what that study is really saying is that the marketplace believes that companies that deliver a great customer experience over the long term are simply more valuable than those that do not. And that's a takeaway that's relevant whether you are a public or a private entity. So that's the first thing I would say, is just to sort of shake people by the shoulders, show them that research, because it gives them an inkling, wait, maybe there is something to this. And then the second thing that I would suggest that I think is very helpful in motivating change and really lighting a fire under people is to allow them to viscerally experience the experience as it stands now. For example, getting the board of directors and the top executives in a room and calling your 800 line with a couple of, pretending to be a customer and seeing what it feels like and what it sounds like, or actually getting them to, unwrap and assemble a product that you sell. When you get executives to actually see with their own eyes, either by doing it themselves or watching a customer struggle with it, when you see them, when they have a chance to do that, I find that actually turns the tide a bit, because no executive wants to lead a company where, you're not enriching people's lives, where you're frustrating and annoying customers. Nobody likes that. And so I find that really kind of lights a fire under executives, because it's almost a source of pride. I don't want my customers to have to deal with that horrible 800-line experience. We've got to change that. So those would be my two suggestions.
Okay. And I'm reading the question again because I read it to you, but as I'm reading it, I'm wondering if so she said, when introducing customer experience as an important concept that needs to be prioritized by the executive team so the whole company gets on board, where would you start? I believe you answered it the way she was asking it, but it brought me to a second question. Now,
Yep.
What if the executives are on board, they know they want to do this? Would you also have like the call center, have people calling in and experiencing as a customer as well? Because obviously, if this is something that they're doing all the time, maybe they should be experiencing that as
Yeah.
well. Would you start at lower
Absolutely.
level as well?
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And actually, companies that I admire, one of the things they do in their call centers, not to suggest again that customer experience is just about call centers, but
Right.
one of the things that they do with their call centers is they regularly get their teams of call center agents together and they play for them great calls and not so great calls. And they do it over and over again with different calls, and it just helps to socialize the right behaviors. So yes, I think it is very valuable for people on the front line to actually see what it feels like to be a customer, because if you're there, just answering the phone, you might lose sight of what it actually feels like to be on the other end of the line. And so the more you can give people on the front line that line of sight to what that customer experience feels like, the better position they're going to be to make personal changes to deliver a better interaction.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have, and thank you, Maureen. I appreciate that question. Speaking from experience, because I don't have a call center per se, and people who call in or email in usually get myself or someone from my small team. But what I've done is gone on my website before and felt, okay, if I'm looking for a speaker, how easy it is for me to find
Right.
what I'm looking for? Because sometimes you think something looks the way it's supposed to, and then when you start doing it, you're like, oh my gosh, this led me completely to a different place
Right.
than I was expecting it to. Yeah,
Yes.
very, very good
Yeah.
insight.
Yep. And that, unfortunately, is all too common. And there's been studies on this that show that there is really a chasm of perception between companies and customers about how good the experience is. You know, company executives tend to look at it through rose-colored glasses. And then when you ask their customers are like, it stinks. And, you know, often companies just don't realize that until it's too late.
Right. And that's the most important feedback sometimes is if something stinks.
Yeah.
Well, you have not stunk. You've been fantastic. The comments that have come in, awesome info. Thank you. This has been excellent information and very useful. Thank you for sharing with us. I shout that from the rooftops. You know, I'm a huge fan. I think that you're just brilliant and your content is always timely. But right now it just feels like if anything that we can do to make small steps in impressing our customers is fantastic. So, and someone's asking if the recording will be available. Yes, it will. I will be sending out the recording to everyone who registered. So thank you, John.
Well, thank
As
you,
always,
Jenna.
it's a pleasure.
I really appreciate it. It was fun to do.
Okay. Have a
Take
great
care,
day,
everyone.
everybody. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.